Hey there, and welcome. Find that perfect spot in your bed. Let your muscles unwind and take a slow, deep breath in and out. Tonight, we're going to journey back in time, not to the grand halls of kings, but to the very edge of human survival. We'll begin in a world gripped by a shadow, the Black Death, and discover the strange, desperate, and surprisingly clever ways one might have made it out alive. Then, as the echoes of that fear recede, we will turn our gaze inward, exploring an even deeper mystery, the human mind. We'll trace the long, often brutal history of how we've understood and misunderstood the voices in our heads. So dim the lights, close your eyes, and let these whispers of survival guide you into a peaceful, restorative sleep. Our journey begins now. Chapter 1. Under the Black Shadow, a strange guide to surviving the plague. Let's begin our journey in the year 1348 with the most fundamental choice you could make. Where do you call home? If your answer is a bustling, vibrant city like London, Paris, or Florence, a hub of culture, trade, and opportunity, then I have some unfortunate news. You are, statistically speaking, already walking towards your own grave. The cities of the 14th century, during the reign of the Black Death, were not the charming medieval postcards we imagine. They were overpopulated, unwashed, and horrifyingly efficient death traps. Picture it. Thousands of people crammed into narrow, winding streets, living in timber-framed houses stacked one against the other. There was no plumbing, no concept of sanitation. Waste, both human and animal, was simply tossed from the windows into the streets below, creating a thick, putrid sludge that coated the cobblestones. These urban centers were the plague's all-you-can-eat buffet. Close quarters for airborne transmission? Check. Open gutters serving as rat highways? Check. Families living indoors with their livestock, chickens, pigs, and goats for warmth and security? You bet. The fleas, the tiny, black horsemen of this apocalypse, carried by the ubiquitous rats, had found their paradise. And you, the innocent city dweller, perhaps just on your way to the market to buy a handful of onions, were one single, unnoticed bite away from a full-body breakdown. So, what was the intelligent move? The only move, really. Flee. Flee to the countryside as if your life depended on it. Because it did. Yes, the countryside presented its own set of challenges: loneliness, harsh weather, unpredictable harvests, and the occasional angry goose. But it offered one priceless commodity: space. Fewer neighbors meant fewer crowds, fewer shared wells, and significantly fewer rats per square foot. If you were fortunate enough to live on a remote farm, or in a sleepy village perched on a high, windy hill, where your nearest human contact was to go lengths away, your odds of survival skyrocketed. The wealthy understood this instinctively. At the first whisper of the plague's arrival, nobles and rich merchants, like the characters in Boccaccio's Decameron, didn't hesitate. They packed up their finest silks, their casks of wine, and their books of poetry, and retreated to their secluded country villas. There, they practiced a very luxurious form of social distancing, whiling away the days with storytelling and music, with absolutely zero contact with the peasantry. But you didn't need to be rich to embrace this strategy. Even the humble shepherds, the solitary goat herds, and that one hermit down the lane who was known for talking to birds, they all had the right idea. The single most effective survival strategy in 1348 was to put as much distance as possible between yourself and other people. If flight wasn't an option, if you were bound to the city by trade or poverty, the next best thing was to turn your home into a fortress. Become a recluse. No one in the 14th century knew what a virus or bacterium was, but they learned one thing with terrifying clarity. Proximity to the sick meant you were next. If a neighbor started sweating, coughing up blood, or developing the telltale dark, swollen lymph nodes, the buboes, it was time to bar the door and ignore the world. Social distancing didn't have a catchy name, but the survivors practiced it with religious fervor. This meant a total withdrawal from public life. Markets, festivals, weddings, funerals, even church services, any large gathering was a game of microbiological roulette. The temptation to join in was immense, but the people who had the foresight and the willpower to resist, to stay home and talk to their cat instead of their neighbor, were the ones who had a real shot at seeing the next spring. It was a brutal form of social and familial triage. Was it agonizingly difficult when your own cousin came knocking, his face pale with fever, begging for a sip of soup and sneezing through the keyhole? Extremely, but to open that door was to invite death in to sit at your table. It meant your entire family would likely be dead by Sunday. So, with a heavy heart, you had to say no soup for Cousin Gregory. Your profession also played a massive role in your fate. In this new, terrifying economy, certain jobs became de facto death sentences. Take the messengers, for example. Their entire livelihood depended on riding between plague-ridden towns, carrying letters, royal decrees, and news of the spreading sickness. With every scroll they handed over, they were essentially participating in a lethal exchange program, swapping paper and plague. Merchants, too, were doomed. They were the engine of trade, but also the primary vectors of the disease. Their ships and carts, traveling from port to port, carried not just spices from the east and wool from Flanders, but stowaway rats and their deadly cargo of fleas. They were the unknowing super spreaders of the 14th century. So what were the safer jobs? The ones that kept you isolated. Blacksmiths, bakers, and millers often worked alone or with a small, trusted team. They were surrounded by the protective heat of the forge or the familiar dust of the grain, and their work was local. They didn't need to travel far or shake hands with an endless stream of strangers. And then there were the grave diggers. It sounds morbid, but it was, strangely, a relatively secure position. The job was by no means plague-proof, but the men who did it developed a grim, practical wisdom. They often worked with rudimentary protective gear, gloves, heavy cloaks, and cloths over their faces. They used long-handled shovels and learned, out of sheer necessity, the highly underrated strategy of not touching corpses with their bare hands. They became unwilling experts, able to recognize the signs of the plague, and they took a strange pride in their own survival while the world around them perished. Even your personal hygiene, or lack thereof, could tip the scales between life and death. By the 14th century, the great public bathhouses of earlier medieval times had largely fallen out of favor, often viewed with moral suspicion by the church. Worse still, the so-called medical experts of the day promoted a truly terrible idea: They believed that bathing in hot water opened the pores of the skin, making a person more vulnerable to the bad air, or miasma, that they thought caused the plague. This, of course, was the exact opposite of the truth. The plague-carrying fleas were drawn to the scent of unwashed bodies. They thrived in the folds of dirty, sweat-soaked wool. Therefore, people who bathed, even infrequently, were less attractive hosts. Soap, a crude but effective concoction of animal fat and wood ash, existed. Those who used it, perhaps simply out of a personal desire for cleanliness, were inadvertently practicing advanced pest control. The survivors were often those who made a habit of washing their hands and face, and those who took the time to boil their linen undergarments. By today's standards, it was minimal. By the standards of the plague era, it was practically sterile. And what if, despite all your precautions, you felt the fever begin to rise? The worst thing you could do was call a doctor. The medieval physician, with his grand theories of the verhumer's blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, was a man of great confidence and catastrophically bad advice. His solution for almost any ailment was to balance your humors, which usually meant draining something vital from your already weakened body. He would apply leeches until you were pale and faint, or worse, take a blade and slice open a vein to let the bad spirits out, a practice that often just hastened the inevitable. The iconic plague doctors, with their long beak masks, looked terrifying, and their treatments were even more so. The beak was stuffed with aromatic herbs, flowers, and spices, lavender, mint, cloves, based on the flawed theory that good smells could ward off the bad air. It was a primitive form of PPE, but their prescribed cures were pure fantasy. They would advise you to rub onions on your armpits, to drink a potion of powdered emeralds, or to carry a dead, dried toad in a bag around your neck. In this environment of medical chaos, the people who often fared best were those who avoided professional help altogether. They relied instead on the quiet wisdom of herbalists, midwives, and their own common sense. In the end, surviving the Black Death wasn't about finding a miracle cure. It was a grim calculation of geography, isolation, a healthy dose of antisocial behavior, and a little bit of luck. The boring, the isolated, and the clean had the last laugh. Chapter 2. The Labyrinth of the Mind. How we have understood madness. As the physical plague of the 14th century receded, it left behind a world forever scarred, a world that now had to grapple with the invisible plagues of the human mind. The history of how we understand mental illness is a long, winding, and often brutal journey. Long before psychiatry had a name, or the brain was understood as the seat of consciousness, madness was seen not as a medical condition, but as a message from another realm or a curse. Our story begins in the cradle of civilization, ancient Mesopotamia, in the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Here, if a person experienced hallucinations, spoke in nonsensical tongues, or withdrew into a catatonic state, the first assumption was not illness, it was possession. The Sumerians and Babylonians believed that a host of evil spirits, restless ghosts of the dead, and wrathful demons could invade the human body, seizing control of one's thoughts and actions. A disturbed mind was simply a soul that had been hijacked. Consequently, the earliest recorded treatments were not medical, but magical. Clay tablets, from the library of Ashurbanipal in Assyria describe in great detail the complex incantations, elaborate rituals, and specific sacrifices required to coax or command the spiritual invader to leave. An exorcist priest would chant over the afflicted, sometimes using foul-smelling substances or loud noises to make the body an inhospitable place for the demon. In this world, the exorcist was more trusted than the physician, and the line between a healer and a priest was almost non-existent. In ancient Egypt, the view was slightly different, but no less spiritual. The Egyptians believed the heart, not the brain, was the seat of intelligence and emotion. Mental distress was often attributed to a physical ailment with a spiritual twist. For instance, the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents in existence, describes a condition similar to depression, attributing it to the influence of malevolent gods or the spirits of the dead. For women, a common diagnosis was the wandering womb, the belief that the uterus could detach and travel throughout the body, causing emotional turmoil, erratic behavior, and shortness of breath. The cure involved pleasant-smelling incenses and potions designed to lure the womb back to its proper place. It was a world where medicine was a blend of pharmacology, prayer, and magical thinking. It was the ancient Greeks who first introduced a revolutionary duality to the concept of madness. On one hand, they saw it as the work of the gods. In Homer's epic poems, the great hero Ajax, driven mad by the goddess Athena after being denied the armor of Achilles, slaughters a flock of sheep, believing them to be his Greek rivals. This was not a failing of his mind, but a divine intervention, a punishment from on high. The philosopher Plato took this idea even further, arguing that some forms of madness were, in fact, divine gifts. He spoke of 4 types of divine madness: the prophetic madness of the oracle at Delphi, the poetic madness of the inspired artist, the erotic madness of the true lover, and the ritualistic madness of the religious mystic. To be mad in this sense was to be touched by the gods, to have a connection to a reality beyond the mundane. But on the other hand, a physician named Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine, offered a radically different, more grounded explanation. He forcefully rejected supernatural causes and instead proposed the theory of the 4 humors. The body, he argued, was composed of 4 essential fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was a state of perfect balance between them, while illness, both physical and mental, was the result of an imbalance. The condition of melancholia, which we might now recognize as clinical depression, was, in Hippocrates' view, caused by an excess of black bile, which he believed originated in the spleen. His prescribed solutions were remarkably modern: a balanced diet, proper rest, regular exercise, and a calm, peaceful environment. For centuries to come, this duality would define the Western view of mental illness. Was a person possessed by a demon, or simply suffering from a wandered womb or bad digestion? With the rise of Christianity and the decline of the Roman Empire, this delicate balance was shattered. Throughout the long medieval period in Europe, any notion of divine madness was largely erased, and the physical explanations of Hippocrates were overshadowed by theology. The Church stepped in, and with it came fire, brimstone, and an overwhelming fear of the demonic. If you were hearing voices, The likely conclusion was no longer a humoral imbalance. It was sin, or worse, Satan himself making a home in your soul. The mentally ill were now viewed through a harsh religious lens. They were seen as morally corrupt, spiritually weak, or actively possessed by diabolical forces. A peasant woman who wandered the streets muttering to herself, suffering from what might have been schizophrenia, was now a prime candidate for a witchcraft accusation. A nobleman who wept for days without apparent cause, perhaps in the throes of a deep depression, could be suspected of harboring a terrible, unconfessed sin that was rotting his soul from the inside. There were no hospitals for the mind, only dungeons, chains, and the harsh judgment of the community. In some towns, the mad were chained in public squares, where locals could poke them with sticks or throw food at them for amusement. Madness became a form of grim public entertainment, a cautionary tale made flesh. It was in this era, in the 13th century, that Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London was founded, originally a priory for the crusading order of St. Mary of Bethlehem. It soon began to house the mentally disturbed and became infamous under its new, shortened name, Bedlam. Bedlam quickly devolved from a place of refuge into a human zoo. For a small fee, wealthy Londoners and tourists could tour the wards and gape at the lunatics chained to the walls, howling and writhing in their own filth. The treatments were designed not to heal, but to punish the body in order to save the soul. They consisted of brutal cold water dunkings until the patient was near drowned, starvation to weaken the body and the demon within, severe bleeding to let out the bad blood, and frequent whippings, all intended to drive the devil out by sheer force and terror. Bedlam became a byword for chaos and suffering, a dark monument to an age of profound ignorance and fear. The Renaissance brought a flicker of change as classical Greek and Roman knowledge was rediscovered. The medical ideas of Hippocrates were revisited. Physicians began, cautiously, to reframe mental illness through the lens of anatomy and imbalance rather than demons, but the treatments remained terrifyingly brutal. The asylum as an institution grew more common, not out of a new sense of compassion, but out of a desire to protect normal society from the unpredictable and the frightening. The asylum became a convenient tool for those in power, unwanted wives, political rivals, or rebellious daughters who defied patriarchal authority could be quietly declared insane and locked away indefinitely, without trial or recourse. It was a diagnosis that could silence anyone. The Enlightenment of the 18th century promised a new age of reason over superstition, but for the mentally ill, this simply meant being reclassified from sinners to scientific specimens. The asylum became a vast, state-run institution, a warehouse for the unwanted. This was, ironically, framed as progress. The French physician Philippe Pinel famously ordered the chains to be removed from the female inmates at the Salpêtrière Asylum in Paris in 1793. It was a revolutionary and humane gesture, but while the physical chains were gone, new, invisible ones were forged. Patients were now subjected to moral therapy, a rigid regimen of strict discipline, forced labor, and lectures on proper social behavior. Recovery was equated with quiet compliance and obedience. The Victorian era of the 19th century perfected this art of hiding what it feared most, especially when it came to women. Almost any form of emotional expression, intellectual ambition, or independent thought could be diagnosed as hysteria, a catch-all term that effectively pathologized female behavior. The term itself derived from the Greek word for uterus, rooted in the ancient belief that a woman's emotional state was dictated by her womb. The infamous rest cure, prescribed by doctors like S. Weir Mitchell, confined women to their beds for weeks or even months, forbidding them from reading, writing, or even talking, a form of sensory deprivation that often drove them to the brink of true madness. In Paris, the neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot became a sensation with his public lectures at the Salpêtrière Hospital, where he would demonstrate hypnosis on his female hysterical patients, inducing dramatic fits and convulsions for an audience of male medical students. It was half science, half theater, and sitting in that audience, taking careful notes, was a young Viennese doctor named Sigmund Freud. He began to do something radical. He listened. He sat and listened to his hysterical female patients talk about their lives, their dreams, and their traumas. From these conversations, he would develop the talking cure, and the entire field of psychoanalysis would be born, opening the door to the inner world of the mind. But the most profound turning point in our understanding of mental illness came not from a doctor's office, but from the muddy, blood-soaked trenches of World War I. Soldiers returned from the front lines shaking uncontrollably, haunted by phantom gunfire, or rendered completely mute by the sheer terror they had witnessed. The military brass initially dismissed it as cowardice or malingering, but the condition was too widespread to ignore. They called it shell shock. For the first time, severe mental illness was undeniably linked not to sin, moral failing, or a weak constitution, but to overwhelming, inescapable trauma. It could happen to the strongest of men, to decorated heroes. This shocking realization forced medicine and society to confront the mind's breaking point. This led to a new wave of interventions in the mid-20th century, some of them horrific. The prefrontal lobotomy, a procedure that involved severing connections in the brain's frontal lobes, was pioneered by Aegis Manas, who won a Nobel Prize for it. It was brutally popularized in the U.S. by Dr. Walter Freeman with his ice-pick lobotomy, a quick, crude procedure that left thousands of patients, including President Kennedy's sister Rosemary, in a permanent, childlike state. At the same time, electroconvulsive therapy ECT was used, often without anesthesia, to induce seizures in an attempt to reboot the brain. While it provided relief for some with severe depression, it was a terrifying and often abused practice. It wasn't until the 1960s, with the rise of the civil rights movement and a new focus on patient rights, that the great asylums began to be emptied. This movement, known as deinstitutionalization, was fueled by the development of new antipsychotic drugs and the promise of community-based care. On paper, it was a humanitarian triumph. In practice, it was a chaotic failure of funding and infrastructure, leaving many of the most vulnerable on the streets. This long, painful history brings us to today. Our journey out of the labyrinth is far from over, but for the first time, we are beginning to hold a map, one drawn not with chains and fear, but with empathy, science, and the quiet hope of understanding. And so, our journey through these whispers of survival comes to a close. We have walked through a world decimated by plague, learning that survival often hinged on the simple, quiet choices: a retreat to the countryside, a locked door, a clean pair of hands. Then we navigated the labyrinth of the human mind, tracing its path from divine curse to medical condition, from chains and exorcisms to the quiet hope of understanding. These two histories, one of the body and one of the mind, remind us of our own resilience and our long, ongoing struggle to conquer both the shadows without and the shadows within. Now, let these stories settle. Let the echoes of the past soften and fade, like the last embers of a fire glowing in the dark, before they turn to peaceful ash. There is nothing left to do now but rest. Feel the weight of the day begin to lift from your shoulders. Let go of every thought, every worrying. Allow the gentle quiet to envelop you like a soft, warm blanket. Your journey for tonight is over. It is time to drift peacefully and deeply into your dreams. Sleep well